Now let me introduce you to this evening's speaker, Professor Christian Rutz. Professor Rutz has broad interests in animal behavior and cognition, human evolution, animal tracking technologies, conservation science, and policy making. He's well known for his long-term studies of tool using, New Caledonian and Hawaiian crows, and his innovative biologging research. He's founding president of the International Biologging Society, as well as co-founder and chair of the COVID-19 Biologging Initiative. Based at University of St. Andrews, he's a National Geographic Explorer and Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Linnaean Society of London. He's won numerous awards and prizes, and he's here this evening to present insights from the most ambitious animal tracking study ever conducted, the COVID-19 Logging Initiative. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to present here today. I'm really excited to share this work with you. I will tell you over the next 40 minutes or so about an initiative we have launched during COVID-19 lockdowns, the COVID-19 Biologging Initiative, and it's all about tracking wildlife during what we have called the Anthropause. Human-wildlife interactions take various shapes. In some cases, they are lethal. You see in this image here, a fishing trawler extracting fish for human consumption. Those fish die. This is another example of a highly destructive form of interaction. Here, humans have logged large stretches of the Amazon forest, and I think it's fair to assume that most animal species will struggle to make good use of the habitat patch on the right-hand side. But there are other kinds of human-wildlife interactions that are more subtle and usually non-lethal. So this is a good example here. This is a moose that is thinking long and hard about whether it should cross this road. And that decision may be affected by a variety of factors. First of all, the road itself may act as a barrier. It cuts the habitat in two, and that alone may prevent the moose from crossing. But you also see cars in the distance, that some of which are moving towards the moose. So it's the presence of humans and their vehicles that may affect the moose's movements in this landscape. This is another example, and probably quite familiar to some of you. This is a fox in a city center in a British town. And this fox seems quite relaxed about the presence of those pedestrians, but chances are that the presence of those humans will have an effect on its ranging behavior. And that could be both positive and negative. It could be through the provision of food, or it could be through disturbance. It is these more subtle interactions, the non-lethal kind, I will be focusing on today. Understanding these human-wildlife interactions really matters, and I will briefly explain why. There is an increasing realization that in order for humanity to thrive and stay healthy, it is important to look after our environment and look after the species with whom we share this planet. And there are highly complex and important linkages between us humans and non-human animals that share space with us, but also ecosystems more generally. This is the one world, one health concept many of you will have heard about. Now, appreciating these complex interactions across various scales is absolutely key to preserving global biodiversity, to maintaining the integrity of ecosystems, to preventing the spread of diseases, including some that jump from wildlife to humans, and predicting environmental change. So we really must get a good handle on understanding these interactions in some detail. There is now overwhelming evidence that human activities affect animals on a global scale, and that includes their movements. And I will give you two examples here. This is a landmark study published by Marley Tucker and co-authors in 2018 in the journal Science. And they found that mammals, terrestrial mammals, move shorter distances in areas with high human footprint. So you see on the y-axis here, that's the animal movement distance, and on the x-axis here, you see the human footprint index, which is a measure of how dominated by human activity a landscape is. And you see that in the most dominated, in the most human-modified habitats, animals move shorter distances. There is an equally important paper also published in 2018 in Science by Caitlin Gaynor and co-authors that found that mammals are more nocturnal in areas with high human disturbance. What you see here is study pairs where one is a high human disturbance area, that's the red dots, and that is paired with one that experiences lower human disturbance. And you see when you rank these, that in the vast majority of cases, the degree of nocturnality is higher for the highly disturbed areas. So we know from these global studies that animal activity and animal movements are affected by human activity. There are other ways in which researchers study potential impacts of human activities on wildlife, and I want to briefly review these because they, I think, help understand some of the opportunities, the research opportunities I will describe later. Quite a common study approach is what is known a before-after comparison. So you see some hypothetical data. This is some parameter of interest. It could be anything. It could be the reproductive behavior of a particular study species or an aspect of its movement ecology. And that is being tracked over time. And then at some point, that system was impacted by some external stressor. And the researchers studied the system before the impact happened and after the impact happened. And you see in this cartoon illustration, there was actually a measurable change. A good example of this is shown here on the right. You see an area in California in 2011, just before the construction of large solar panels, which were erected in 2015. And you could imagine a study that looks at wildlife behavior, for example, or demographics of a particular population before and after this construction event. Complementary to this is a design called control impact. So again, we have an impact event, but then the effect of this impact is assessed by comparing an area where the impact was felt by the system and a control area that was unaffected. And you see again in this cartoon example, there is a difference. It looks like something has happened in the impacted area. A good example of this is urban-rural comparison. Quite often wildlife biologists conduct studies in paired study sites where they have an urban study area and then an adjacent rural study area. And they might ask whether, for example, the foraging behavior or the movement ecology of animals differs in these two adjacent habitats. And then what is usually considered the gold standard in the field is a combination of the two. And unsurprisingly, it's called a before-after control impact design. So you have both the timeline and you have the between study area comparison. It's a so-called Backy design. Now, these studies are incredibly powerful, but it's near impossible to pull them off on a reasonable spatiotemporal scale. But there are other problems with studying potential impacts of human activity on wildlife. When we consider, for example, the human footprint, different kinds of impacts are usually confounded, and I will explain what I mean by that. The human footprint certainly comprises the presence of us humans in the environment. It's us humans walking around, pedestrians. Remember that photo of the red fox in a British city. So it's us in the landscape. But we also have our transport vehicles. We've got our cars and ships and planes. And importantly, we also modify landscapes with physical infrastructure, which usually remains fairly static. So that's our roads and buildings. And under normal circumstances, these three types of potential sources of disturbance are always present. So they are completely confounded. So as a researcher, I don't know what exactly affected my study animals the most, whether it was the presence of humans, whether it was the traffic in the study area, or whether it was those barriers. I showed you the example of the road and the moose. But then something fairly dramatic happened in early 2020, and you all know what I'm referring to. It was the tragic circumstances of the spread of COVID-19. And in order to control the spread of this disease, many governments around the world imposed movement restrictions. At one point, 4.4 billion people sheltered at home around the world. That's more than half of the world's human population. Now, this perturbation was so dramatic in its scale and magnitude that my colleagues and I coined a term to describe it. We called it the Anthropause. There was a brief pause in normal human mobility. And this Anthropause created a valuable research opportunity. I should, before I proceed, acknowledge the human tragedy associated with this event. So when I talk about an opportunity, what I mean is that some researchers, myself and my colleagues included, felt that during this period of crisis, we should work really hard to learn the lessons we can potentially learn. Nobody was excited about what was happening. Many people lost their lives and lost loved ones. But what did happen was that temporarily during these lockdowns, those different types of human disturbance became temporarily dissociated. So as governments imposed restrictions, in many places around the world, humans were asked to shelter at home. So there were fewer people out and about. Vehicle traffic was drastically reduced in large parts of the world. But importantly, all the infrastructure we put into landscapes remained. Those roads were still there. The buildings were still there. So we had an opportunity potentially to examine how animals respond to this perturbation. How do they behave when there are fewer people and fewer vehicles, but they are still moving in the same human-dominated landscape? And you've all heard of these anecdotal observations that were reported at the time. Social media were overflowing with sightings like this. I mean, this is a puma that was spotted in downtown Santiago in Chile. You will have heard about the goats in Landidna and dolphins in the harbor of Trieste in Italy. But how do we know what is anecdote and what really happened? One of the big problems is that, of course, most wildlife biologists who could normally answer these questions were also sheltering at home with their families. They were in lockdown, so they couldn't do their normal observation work. But many of them had, prior to the pandemic, deployed tiny little tracking devices, so-called biologgers, onto wildlife as part of their routine research and conservation work. And those were studies they had supported with their own funding in their own time. Nobody knew that this pandemic was about to happen. But still, those tags had been deployed, and importantly, they remained on the animals and kept sending data via satellite uplink to the researchers who were sitting at home. So this is where some of my colleagues and I realized that there is potentially an extremely valuable research opportunity and something our community can contribute to understanding these human-wildlife interactions. And we decided to analyze animal tracking data that had been collected before, during, and after lockdowns to see at how animal behavior changed. I want to show you just the coverage of animal tracking activity around the world these days. Some of you may have seen episodes of natural history documentaries where researchers attach tags to animals, but that doesn't give you a good idea of the scope and scale of animal tracking that is happening in the 21st century. So these are data pulled over several years and archived in a public data repository called MoveBank. And some of these dots are birds. It includes terrestrial mammals. We've got marine species. And it gives you just a feeling of how good data coverage is these days. So we have potentially a data gold mine, which we can tap for addressing questions like this. When the penny dropped and my colleagues and I realized that this could be a productive area of research, we ran a query on this public data repository MoveBank in April 2020, and we simply asked, like, which data sets are available right now, which one coincide with this first hard lockdown period. And this is the map we produced from that query. So you see a good coverage of avian, terrestrial, and marine studies. When we saw this, we knew we are potentially able to do a large collaborative study if only we manage to engage those data owners. We did another quick check before we committed to launching this initiative, and that was we had a look at data released by Google on changes in human mobility during lockdowns. And this map here shows humans visiting parks, or more specifically, the percentage change in humans visiting parks. Anything shown in red indicates a decrease, anything shown in blue shows an increase. And what you see is an overwhelmingly red map. So globally, there was a sudden reduction in humans being out and about, but you do see those blue patches in North America and parts of Europe. And that is because at that time, some local governments started allowing a form of exercise where people could actually go outside for an hour or longer, and they were flocking to local parks. But this is the perfect set of constellations for doing what I described earlier, is a bucky design, a before-after control impact design, where we have potentially data before, during, and after lockdowns, and we have data from areas that are significantly affected by these changes and others that aren't affected. And actually, we have changes in both directions, an increase and a decrease in human mobility. So when we saw these initial results, we decided to launch what we called the COVID-19 biologging initiative. We had a group of institutions that were thinking along similar lines, and they quickly found each other and decided to launch this initiative and to huddle under the umbrella of the International Biologging Society, which I'm leading as founding president. So that provided the general oversight and governance for this new group. We were very lucky to very quickly secure seed funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the National Geographic Society, who got behind this initiative. Without their support, we couldn't have launched this initiative. And very recently, we were endorsed by the United Nations Ocean Decade, which gave us an additional boost. But importantly, under this governance infrastructure, we managed to bring together over 600 international collaborators. And that's a really diverse group of people. It's wildlife biologists, conservation practitioners, some human geographers who specifically study human movements, movement ecologists, data scientists, and so on. And I believe that in terms of scope and scale, this is the largest such research consortium ever launched in our field. And just to give you an idea of how the initiative has grown, by the latest count, we now have over 1 billion location records for about 13,000 tagged animals across over 200 different species. That's both terrestrial and marine, anything that swims, hops, and flies, across over 350 study populations. So 1 billion location records where we know exactly where a tagged animal was. In most cases, those are GPS fixes. It's the same technology you will have in your smartphone or in your wearables you're wearing. Because this has grown into such a large initiative, we very quickly decided to set up a portfolio of coordinated sub-projects. So rather than doing one big project, we broke this into smaller self-coordinated pieces, which could be led by different groups. And I think this really flat hierarchy was key to the success of the initiative, because it allowed different teams to take ownership of particular parts of the analysis and to then leverage their own networks and resources. So we've got, for example, a group that looks specifically at marine and aquatic animals worldwide. We've got one that does the same thing, but for terrestrial mammals. We've got a sub-project that looks at mammal activity, and in particular with an interest in road crossing behavior, whether that changed when there were fewer cars. We've got one group that has a regional focus on North America, so they look at both birds and mammals. We've got a set of sub-projects that look at birds with an initial focus on raptors, a parallel project on gulls, with the idea of using those as a springboard for doing a project on birds worldwide. We are currently starting a new project where we look at the weekend effect, where wildlife activity is known to change in the course of the working week from the weekdays to the weekend. And there are good reasons to believe that that effect may have dampened during lockdowns. We have one group that looks specifically at human mobility. They don't look at the animals at all. They simply investigate what kind of data we can leverage for analyzing human movements. And we have one that looks at mapping what we have called the Anthropause. And we are using satellite-sensed nightlight data for that. That's a collaboration with NASA. And we have various other sub-projects under development. I want to briefly highlight, showcase the work of this Raptor Subproject, just to give you an idea of one of these sub-projects, what they look like. We chose raptors for various reasons. One of them is that they are of conservation concern. They are apex predators and scavengers that are very important in terms of securing, through their trophic position, ecosystem functioning, ecosystem services. But at the same time, they are highly vulnerable to disturbance and persecution, and they have complex interactions with humans around the world. In some areas, they are revered and they are fed. In others, they are killed because they are being perceived as competition. So we thought that's a good taxonomic group for doing some analyses. We partnered with the Peregrine Fund and a new initiative called the Global Anthropause Raptor Research Network. And I would just like to acknowledge the work of my collaborators on the core team here. You see their names to the left. This sub-project alone has now collated data for over 3,000 tagged raptors, and that's for 330 million GPS fixes. I want to tell you what kind of analyses we are doing. This is just a cartoon illustration of our statistical approach, but it tells you how we use these kinds of data to ask questions about human-wildlife interactions. We're asking whether changes in movement metrics, which we extract from the tracks of those tagged raptors, are explained by a range of other factors. In statistical jargon, they would be called predictors. That includes a measure of the human footprint in an area. And we use the human footprint index for that. That includes a measure of human population density, but also metrics about the environment itself, such as how modified it is. We ask whether it's related to the strength of local lockdowns. That has been measured in a standardized way by the Oxford COVID-19 Stringency Index. And you see a cartoon-like illustration here, how in April, May 2020, those index values really started shooting up. Restrictions were very strict, but then as time progressed, it became more diffuse. We include land productivity. We have NDVI for that. Various bird traits. So we ask, are movement characteristics related to the bird's body mass, their age, sex, and diet, and other factors. So the population identity and the phylogeny. And some of you who have an interest in statistical analyses will recognize that this is effectively the formula of our statistical model, which we use for pulling out lockdown effects. And this, of course, is the term of interest, the strength of lockdowns. It's early days for our data mining, but I can tell you that in preliminary analyses, not just with this project, but other sub-projects of the initiative, we do see a lockdown signal. We do see that lockdowns had a measurable impact on wildlife movement. I just want to give you a particularly exciting case study, which links to this anecdotal observation of the pumas in downtown Santiago in Chile. It turns out when you look at tracking data from that time, that pumas in general actually did come closer to urban settlements. This is a study conducted by Chris Wilmers and colleagues and published last year in Current Biology. So you see on these maps ranging data for several pumas, different colors are used for different animals, pre-lockdown, during the lockdown period, and then post-lockdown. This plot shows how human mobility changed over that time period. So during pre-lockdown, we have like the normal activity, then a sudden drop during lockdowns, and then activity recovers gradually during the post-lockdown phase. And what Chris Wilmers and colleagues discovered is that during the pre-lockdown period, so under the normal conditions, pumas really strongly avoided urban areas. So they kept a good distance to urban edges. They tried to stay away from human settlements, basically. But during lockdown, that relationship flipped. It was reversed. So suddenly, those tagged pumas started coming closer to humans. This is just one example, and it actually feeds into one of the analyses I mentioned of one of the sub-projects where we look at terrestrial mammals globally. But it's not that there is one pattern that fits all. You may remember the headlines from early 2020 where some journalists referred to nature rebounding and nature healing, and that's not what the evidence looks like. This is a good example provided by another major global research consortium called the PUN Environment Working Group, which was spearheaded by Amanda Bates. And they collated information about a large number of study systems from all around the world. So in this case, this is not specifically animal tracking. This could be different kinds of metrics like foraging behavior, reproductive behavior, and so on. But the important point is that when Amanda and her colleagues looked at what we call the effect size of a study, whether or not there was an effect of lockdowns, they obtained a distribution like this, which is centered on 0, which means on average, a study showed no response. And then you had some that responded in one way and others that responded in another way. And it looks like there is this pattern of winners and losers. So very mixed responses. There's clear context dependence. It really depends on the animal species and the location, whether we see an effect or not. And we see very similar results in our animal tracking data. I just want to conclude with some general comments about this idea of using the Anthropause for tackling these really complex issues. And I want to talk you through some cartoon illustrations to illustrate some general points which I think are important and which are sometimes confused when they are being discussed in the media. So this is a schematic illustration of how human mobility may have changed in a particular location during the Anthropause. So we start off with baseline levels, and during the Anthropause, we saw a sudden drop in human mobility, and then it recovers. I want to draw your attention to this spike here. So rather than recovering to baseline levels or levels similar to what we had before the pandemic, I've illustrated that they overshot those levels. And I called this a potential Anthropause. So as certainly the Western world emerges from the pandemic, there are signs that we see local spikes in human mobility. It's not a return to business as usual, but we actually see increased travel activity as people are trying to catch up with travel to see friends and family and catch up with work and catch up with holiday travel. Another important point is to think about the kinds of responses we may see as a result of these changes in human mobility. So this is just an illustration of any odd metric. So here I indicated that this metric showed a decrease. So think about, for example, reproductive output or foraging efficiency or movement distance. It's important to remember that those effects can go into the opposite direction too. So some people started using the term Anthropause as a synonym for a positive effect. That's not how it was intended. It simply refers to this reduction, global scale reduction in human mobility. But the term itself is completely agnostic about the sign of the environmental impacts. It can be positive, it can be negative, or as I mentioned already, in many cases, there's actually a nil response. Systems didn't respond at all, possibly because there wasn't enough time for them to respond. I also want to highlight the point that although in our personal experience, or the experience of most of us, this was unprecedented, there are actually other examples of pauses, temporary pauses in human mobility. And I think that comparing these events provides a really useful window into these deep questions about human-wildlife interactions. And I came up with a way of classifying these different pauses to help the field planning these comparisons. So I imagine a classification scheme with 3 axes. One of them is the magnitude of the event, how severe the reduction in mobility was. The other is the spatial extent, so whether it just affected a local area, it was regional, continental, or global. And the third axis is the duration, from weeks to months to years to decades. So if we take our COVID-19 Anthropause, this is where it approximately sits in this classification cube. It was an event of high magnitude, of global reach, and it lasted for several months. So that's the first hard lockdowns. We then had these successive lockdowns that followed, and they tended to be weaker, they tended to be shorter, so they weren't quite as extreme as the ones we saw in April, May 2020. Some people ask whether the Chernobyl disaster caused an Anthropause. According to this classification scheme, I would say no. It was a pause in human mobility, which had a really high reading on the magnitude scale. So human activity was effectively reduced to 0 in the area, but it was regionally confined, a relatively small area, but it lasted decades. But according to my definition, it falls outside of this Anthropause space. I consider Anthropauses events that occur at continental or global scale and are of high magnitude. But the Black Death pandemic, for example, it's a clear-cut case of an Anthropause. And you see a current theme here that in many cases where we see these drastic reductions in human mobility, they are associated with human tragedy and suffering. And I think it's very important for the research community to acknowledge that and be mindful of that. This is an example of many protected areas that achieve a relatively low reduction in human mobility, are fairly focused on the local scale, so not an Anthropause. Another point I want to make before wrapping up with some general remarks is that I've given you a very simplistic analysis of how these lockdown restrictions affected human mobility, which then in turn affected wildlife. And although that is the primary focus of my research and my colleagues' research, it's important to understand that this is, of course, embedded into an unbelievably complex network of interactions on the global scale. That's why I refer to this here as an Earth systems perspective on the problem. You see all these different interactions between different aspects of human activity. And there is a large research field that is now trying to unpick these relationships. I want to wrap up with some final thoughts about how we can move towards what I call sustainable human-wildlife coexistence. That has to be the ultimate goal of this research, to bring us a step closer to this. What has our initiative achieved, or what are we hoping to achieve? We are in the process of identifying those winners and losers in the Anthropocene. We get a pretty good handle on what makes a species that copes well with human disturbance and that is capable of responding quickly to change, and what makes a species that can't respond so quickly. We move from correlational patterns to causal relationships. So remember those early plots I showed to you where I said, well, you know, mammals move shorter distances in highly disturbed, highly human-dominated landscapes. That's a correlational pattern. The Anthropause and those lockdowns gave us a quasi-experimental context in which we can explore causal relationships. That allows us in turn to develop predictive models of global human impacts and to design effective conservation interventions. So our ambition is to feed all this knowledge into conservation management, environmental planning, going forward. Some general lessons learned. Our collaboration model, I think, for this consortium worked extremely well. This flat governance structure that empowered different groups from around the world to take the lead with particular analyses. We made sure that the research opportunities and the credit cannot be monopolized by individuals or individual teams. We also discovered that the human mobility data products that are available to researchers like myself are largely unsuitable, and those that may be suitable are inaccessible. So there's a real need for the human mobility field and the owners of human mobility data to collaborate closely with wildlife researchers and ecologists. I think we should mobilize now to document the effects of this potential anthropulse, like a spike in mobility as we emerge from the pandemic. And there's an urgent need, I think, for two initiatives. Those are my final two slides. This is the first one. I often get asked, how many tagged animals are there around the world? And all I can say is several thousands, possibly tens of thousands at any moment in time, but nobody knows the exact number. I told you that we ran this query on this data repository MoveBank, but that is a repository that holds data submissions from people who volunteer to participate. And it's only the tip of the iceberg. It's a fraction of what is globally available. So here's the problem. Nobody knows which animals were attacked, when and where. Nobody on the planet, which I think is shocking in the 21st century, and especially given the conservation value of these data. The objective or the challenge is to make all animal tracking data immediately discoverable. We should be able to see at the push of a button who has data for which species. And the solution, I think, is to decouple the metadata from the tags, from the raw tracking data. And I'm happy to explain more why I think that matters. But I think the solution is that we need a global registry for animal tracking tags. Any researcher, doesn't matter whether they are university affiliated or work for an NGO, should, when they put a tag on a wild animal, register that event in a global registry. And this entry will make that activity discoverable for other researchers and organizations. I just proposed this idea in an article in Nature just 2 weeks ago. My vision is to have a registry called TRACK, a tag registry for advancing conservation knowledge. And I think as a community, we should push towards mandatory registration. There are many good reasons for doing that. I can't think of a good reason for not doing that. The quote they fished out here for my piece is, every civil aircraft on the planet must be registered. And that is true. It's like, if we manage to register aircraft, surely we can register animals wearing our tags. I feel we've got a moral obligation to maximize the conservation benefit these data can generate. The other urgent issue is the following one. We had this overwhelming response from the research community, with researchers offering us their hard-won data for collaborative analyses. And of course, they are all involved as co-authors on the papers. But this was a fantastic community effort. But what we learned very quickly is that the vast majority of data sets come from fairly remote places. They come from areas where human activity actually is at relatively low levels anyway, lockdown or not. So there is a clear data deficiency for highly disturbed areas. And it's interesting to speculate why that may be. But this image generated by NASA shows the nightlights of cities and other urban settlements around the world. Well, our world is becoming more and more urbanized. So I argue that going forward, in order to understand those human-wildlife interactions and to mitigate negative impact on wildlife, we must study wildlife where they come into closer contact with humans. And that's in these urban areas and human-dominated areas. So I am now planning to launch a new initiative called the Urban Exploration Project. And the idea is to not retrospectively harvest pre-existing data that have been collected for other purposes previously, but to do a study with strategic tag deployments where we deploy tags on animals in these human-dominated landscapes. And I'm thinking big here. So I think as a community, we should be able to tag in the order of 10,000 animals over a period of time along gradients of urbanization. Of course, it's important to have the urban areas matched with non-urban areas. This is what this might look like. So this is 100 dots on the map. I don't know exactly how many cities might be included. It could be in the order of 20, 50, 100. My idea for running this is actually to set up a global north, global south partnering scheme, because that is something we also noticed with the COVID-19 biologging initiative, that we have predominantly data from the global north, and it would be very important to redress this imbalance, but also to empower our colleagues from the global south to participate in these research activities and to benefit from their outcomes. And so the idea is to partner cities in the global north with cities in the global south that can forge lasting partnerships where expertise and resources are being shared and data are collected in a standardized way. And with this, I will conclude with just some quick acknowledgements. I would like to thank the International Biologging Society, our funders and other partners. Of course, the biologging research community that really pulled together during this period of crisis to do something good, to push for positive change, the steering committee of the initiative. And if you would like to contact me, these are different forms of reaching out. I would really love to hear from you if you're interested in this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian, for a really fantastic talk. It was very interesting to hear about the amount of wildlife tracking happening globally and how collaborative efforts such as the COVID-19 biologging initiative are providing us with much needed insights into human-wildlife interactions in the Anthropocene, and in particular before, during, and after the COVID lockdowns. Now there are some questions from the audience, which I will read out to you. We have a question about which animal species were included in the Tucker et al. Study that you mentioned earlier in your presentation.
Those were terrestrial mammals, and it was a retrospective study. So Marley Tucker and co-authors collated pre-existing data sets, but that included ungulates, it included some carnivores, and it had fairly good global coverage.
A second question asked, why don't we consider urban-rural as before and after experiments, as before human interaction and after, rather than control and effect?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And there is a rich literature on these urban-rural comparisons. One of the problems is that even the rural areas have usually a fairly high degree of human activity. So that refers to these different components of human activity. So you will also have cars and people in the rural area. So because both the habitat structure and the movement of people and vehicles is confounded, it's usually difficult to tease out what exactly drives differences in animal behavior. So it could be that perhaps the rural animals show different behavior because there are fewer roads or there are larger patches of forest, or it could be because there's fewer cars or fewer people. And that's precisely the opportunity that arose during the COVID-19 lockdowns, where this dissociation happened. But going forward, this urban exploration project I mentioned, that is a vision for a research program post-pandemic, and it's precisely studying animal movements along these gradients of urbanization, which I think will be key for moving forward in this field.
Thanks. Another question is whether there are any downsides to having such a huge amount of data. I guess it may complicate analysis as well.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. So it's an unbelievable amount of data. I mean, it's I mentioned the 1 billion GPS fixes. I mean, this no longer fits in a normal spreadsheet. So this is why we have on our team data scientists who are experts in handling these huge volumes of data, and it's expertise we desperately needed. As wildlife biologists, we don't normally handle such data volumes, but if you have if you have the expertise and if you have the infrastructure to handle those big data sets, you can get really fine-grained insights into these patterns. So it's hugely valuable to have these big pooled data sets.
Yeah, I think we all lack more bioinformaticians. They seem to be in high demand. Maybe a related question to that is what software you use for statistical analysis?
So all the software, or most of the software we are using is bespoke developed. So we have in these different sub-projects, usually each sub-project has 1 or 2 statistics and data experts, and they develop the analysis code for analyzing a particular tranche of the data set. But because they are coordinated by the steering committee, they can benefit from each other's expertise. And so we have regular meetings where these sub-projects tell each other what worked and what didn't work, and they are sharing code. But ultimately, all of this is run with bespoke software.
And we have a slightly off-topic question. Susan asked what the skeleton is behind you.
It's a T-Rex skeleton, which my son was really excited about. And when he lost interest, that migrated to my office.
All right. Then another question is how people can get involved in biologging initiative.
Please just reach out. I showed those contact emails. If you, I guess, go to the Linnean Society's website about today's events, you will find my name and contact information. We're very happy to hear from anybody who wants to get involved. And as I said, we are an incredibly mixed group of people. Not everybody in this group is actually tracking animals. We've got people who have got a particular interest in the fundraising or in the conservation management aspect of it. And so any support is most welcome. Just drop me a line.
And then another question, Fatima asked, since most research showed no effect of the Anthropause, are there any ongoing studies replicating the Anthropause, but over a longer time scale, maybe like a common garden experiment?
Yeah, that's a good point. I should clarify that only because a certain proportion of systems where we looked didn't show a response, it doesn't mean that there was a significant impact of the Anthropause. So remember this distribution, it had those tail ends, and we see that in pretty much every data set we look at, whether that's animal tracking or not, that you have animals in certain locations that are responding quite fast and quite dramatically to this environmental perturbation. You have others that respond in the opposite direction, and then you have others that don't respond at all. So I would say there's clearly now overwhelming evidence that nature did respond to the lockdown, but it's a mixed bag. It's not the one fits all. It's the winners and losers. And yeah, and this is something we need to unpack, because if we understand what predicts how an animal responded, then we potentially have the levers for helping those animals that are particularly stressed by human presence. And sometimes people ask me, so what kinds of recommendations may come out of your initiative? We are not going to ask humanity to stay in some sort of state of permanent lockdown. That's not a reasonable proposition. We think that this initiative can generate really innovative ways of rethinking how we share space on this planet with other animals. And so things we are thinking about, for example, having seen our preliminary results from some of the sub-projects, is can we perhaps inform the way our transport networks are structured? And that's not just roads on land, it's also vessel traffic routes at sea. Can we perhaps advise on the flow of traffic on those routes? But you're absolutely right. We are now looking into filling in some of the missing bits with this post-pandemic research. And yeah, the Urban Exploration Project tries to do exactly that. Try and make sense of the things we have glimpsed during the Anthropause.
Hannah says, you mentioned comparing anthropauses. Have there been any tracking records showing animals' response to wars, for example?
Yeah, that's a very good point. There is actually a literature on that, and as you can imagine, it's a very sensitive topic. But ecologists have started looking into how nature is affected in war zones. There's also a rich literature on the effects of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. But it's important to remember that whilst these are tragic events, we kind of most researchers who are working on these topics, they feel that we have a responsibility to learn the lessons that can be learned. The situation on this planet has become extremely desperate. We have a real urgency to understand these relationships, and so with the right amount of sensitivity, I think it is important to look at these events. Yeah.
Amanda asked whether you think availability of good tracking technology is still a bottleneck for wildlife research.
Yeah, the technology has advanced dramatically over just the last 10 years. I mean, GPS tags have become incredibly small and powerful and long-lasting. But you are right, most devices are still memory and battery limited. There's a size limit to the kind of animal you can fit with a tag. So there's definitely scope for further innovation. I think what really is missing is to do these studies that use standardized technology across large number of animals. So whilst this data pooling was very helpful and provided these unprecedented insights, those are tags from different manufacturers deployed in slightly different ways on slightly different settings. I think we can really produce a step change if we turn this around and say, okay, the community now gets together for planned strategic deployments of tags on animals. And that's what we are hoping to do next.
Then we have another question, whether you think we are limiting research close to urban areas, as we may not want to know that the animals are close to the urban areas.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I think there are many reasons why we may have this research bias, and that could be one of them. I mean, there's a range of reasons. It could also be related to our funding structures, that perhaps there is an incentive to explore more remote places. And I don't suggest with my proposal for the urban exploration project that those studies in more remote areas should stop. We need them, and quite often they are of huge conservation value because they look at threatened species or habitats that are under threat. But we need to redress this imbalance. I think we need to quite urgently find out how animals fare at this interface with humans, where they get closer to us, because that I guess we have to accept as part of our future on this planet, that we have to find ways of sharing increasingly limited space.
And then David asked, which species of animal took the most advantage of the Anthropause to increase the extent of movement, especially in urban areas?
It's too early to say, really. I mean, we've got a few species which clearly started roaming more widely and started crossing roads more frequently. And I mean, I gave the example of the puma, which I think is a beautiful study, which really is pretty compelling evidence that they completely changed their movement behavior. But it's important to remember that we also see signals of other species that seem to have come under increasing stress. And that could be because food resources they normally exploit disappeared. So that could be anthropogenic food, like discarded food, or it could be at rubbish dumps and so on. Or it could be because they've become increasingly a target of persecution and poaching. And so this is exactly what I meant, like where it becomes quite clear that in some cases, humans actually serve as guardians or protective shields for animals, and in others, a slight reduction in human activity seems to have a positive effect.
And then another question is whether logging information, all the used logging information, has been derived from tags, and how much data is derived from visual sightings or track sources.
So the COVID-19 biologging initiative currently only uses data collected by these animal-borne tags. And they come in different formats. vast majority of tags we use are GPS tags, which provide highly accurate spatial temporal information. So it's basically dots on a map, but some tags also provide acceleration data. So that's the technology we have in our fitness wearables. You know, when you have a wristband that tells you that you have to walk more steps or sleep more, this technology is now also used for wildlife, and that is really useful. And we have some projects that look at these acceleration data to see whether the actual body movement of animals has changed, and their resting periods, their sleep periods, and so on. But everything in this first pass is sensed by tags on animals and is then combined with information about human movements.
I also had a question, and one of the audience has also just remarked on it. You showed us a lot of animal tracking happening, but can you say anything about how many different species are being tracked and whether they represent just mammals and birds, or whether groups such as amphibians or invertebrates are being tracked as well?
It's heavily biased towards mammals and birds, and that reflects the fact that some of the smaller taxa can't be tagged, or not for longer periods of time. So amphibians and so on are definitely underrepresented. But this 1 billion fixes data set I mentioned, that includes everything. So we've got everything in there from songbirds to whales and everything in between. And it was when we saw the richness of the data set that we made this decision to launch these different sub-projects, where we have a group that looks specifically at all marine creatures, one that looks at anything that flies. And of course, I didn't mention the ultimate plan is to, at some point, bring together the results of all these sub-projects. I think we've now got 10 sub-projects, so they are now producing their independent, coordinated outputs, but then ultimately we want to bring everything together.
And then a question on marine species. Was the tracking focused more on coastal areas or further away from anthropogenic impacts?
That's a very good question. So again, it's entirely driven by data availability. So we can only use what is available and what researchers are willing to share with us, and that is a mix. So we have some tracking data from the high seas, for example, from pelagic shark species, but we also have tracking data from coastal regions, and it's actually the marine sub-project I mentioned. They are particularly interested in these coastal areas because this is probably where there was fairly dramatic changes in vessel traffic. I also mentioned we have this sub-project that looks at gulls. One of the reasons for choosing gulls as a taxonomic group is that they live at this marine terrestrial interface. And so we see them as an opportunity for merging our expertise in the terrestrial and marine realm. So, and this is something where we will look specifically at gulls foraging in these coastal zones.
Then one last question. You've covered some of it in your talk as well, but perhaps you can just repeat the key points of lessons learned before we close.
The lessons learned are that humanity has a measurable impact on wildlife. We have learned that there are opportunities for mitigating some of these impacts. We know that this is urgent. It requires exactly this kind of initiative. It requires the mobilization of an entire research community, and further downstream, it'll now require engagement of other stakeholders, policymakers, managers, and so on. But I think the good news is that through these studies, we learn how to tackle these very urgent, very complex problems. And so I certainly see a clear path forwards, and rather than being pessimistic, I have a very optimistic outlook that we can use this newfound knowledge and feed that into current decision-making processes in a way that benefits not just us, but also other animals on this planet.
Thank you very much. I think with that, I would really like to thank Professor Rutz again for a really great talk. And thank you all for joining us this evening and for engaging in the Q&A session. Thank you and have a really nice evening.
Thanks for having me.